forum. The composition of the forums is also deliberate: staff, students, and professors. We recognize that many of the world's problems, including anti-Black violence and systemic racism, are complex and thus require complex solutions. It also requires collective analysis and solutions, university and community. So we made a space at our table for community representation, their knowledge, understanding, experiences, and perspectives. Universities who stand alone, thinking in elitist ways, and ignoring their own perpetuated histories of racism, sexism, homophobia, and all other discriminatory ideas are and will remain part of the problem. Dalhousie was once like this, but it has been changing. The current situation propels us to move faster and more deliberate while negotiating the limitations of COVID-19. This forum is an extremely small manifestation of one of the ways we are changing. Why today's forum focused on mental health? After 2 episodes of extremely difficult conversations, it struck us. Along with the avenue to vent, the mental stress of the 2 pandemics disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color on and off the campus. It was and continued to affect our panelists, our listeners, members of the communities from which the victims of the pandemics come from. And as we try to humanize the victims of systemic racism and police violence by saying their names, we wanted to use this forum to humanize the families and relatives of the communities of the victims. We at Dalhousie recognize, understand, and care about the social psychological impact of what is happening, including the mental stresses of our communities on and off the campus. It takes a village to raise a child is now a common phrase that most people understand. But what about the pain that village experiences when a child, a mother, a brother, or neighbor dies because of systemic racism in our health system and criminal justice system? In our educational system, do we want to be a university that is located in a village or an institution that is part of that village? Many at Dalhousie are from these communities and closely work and interact with members. For the Black, Indigenous, people of color at Dalhousie, we carry the responsibilities of the institution, our families, and our communities. And we do this with great stress. And for most of us, we have to keep up with a persona of being strong, because in today's society, strength equates successful performance. This forum tonight is dedicated to Dalhousie's faculty and staff who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Research shows that the burden or the labor of love that we carry in making sure that social justice prevails for our respective communities on and off campus comes with a great deal of stress. We're here today to talk about this. We also dedicate this forum to the women from these communities who carry us all. Even at times when you may be sick and tired of being sick and tired, you do not stop. Is this the last forum? Great question. We want you, our listeners, to tell us. The chat feature is not open, but you can see our contact information, the HRAS email. Please speak truth to power and let us know your thoughts, feedback, suggestions for future themes if you would like for us to continue. For now, we are taking a pause to breathe and rejuvenate for the continued fight against systemic racism and all forms of discrimination and oppression. So thank you, the audience, for being our strength. And before I introduce our Director for Indigenous Community Engagement, Catherine Martin, who herself is testimony to everything I just said, and who will co-facilitate by introducing our panelists, there are a few housekeeping things that I must let you know. As I said before, chat has been disabled for participants, but you can ask questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will monitor the Q&A and ask your question. We may not have time to answer all, but we'll try to group them around themes. Given the size of the event, we are unable to interact with folks with raise your hand feature. So please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. The session will be recorded and posted on our website. This is a virtual forum, so there could be some technical glitches. We ask for your patience. The video camera and microphones of the speakers will be turned off to allow one speaker at a time. So now I will turn my camera and speaker off and have Catherine take over as co-facilitator. And thank you. Catherine, it's all yours.
Pwede, edawalok tiok. Nin gadalanan maltai, weligiskuk. Is everybody okay out there? Okay, I'd just like to welcome everybody to the forum and welcome you to Mi'kma'ki, to the unceded territory of my ancestors, and especially to this territory, which is part of my own ancestors' hunting and trapping grounds. I'd like to welcome our panelists, for especially thank them for in accepting this this opportunity to share your words. And I also want to say that it seems like every time we have one of these forums, something immediately or something has happened like right that day or a couple of days before that just makes it much more relevant. And I'm so glad we have the opportunity to share this together, share our thoughts. The most recent that I remember having just happened was the issues around Tobias Doucette and how he recently was being sought after by the police and in Bridgewater, and the fears that we all had and the stress and the anxiety of no, not again. What happens? What if they kill him? I know a lot of people were talking like that, but it just made me so happy to hear that the community, the chief, and the police all came together to figure out how to do this right. And together they worked on finding ways to bring Tobias home, and it worked. So I think it's relevant to our first forum, Black Lives Matter, and our second and our third forum, because it's relevant and it's time that we talk about these. So at this point, I would love to introduce our panelists. Winnie Grant is the mother of two beautiful African Nova Scotia women. I didn't get the names. Kiaisha and Castiva Benton enjoys her 5.5-month-old grandson and is married to her partner, George Grant. Winnie holds a position of Senior Advisor on African Nova Scotian issues with the Department of Community Services and is an adjunct professor at Dalhousie School of Social Work. Winnie attained her Bachelor and Master's of Social Work degrees at Dalhousie University. Winnie's Master of Social Work thesis is entitled The Evolution of African Conscience, the Effects of Racism on Africans in the Diaspora. Winnie has also completed a Master of Education in Lifelong Learning with an Afrocentric focus on policy development at Mount St. Vincent University. Winnie is a licensed social worker with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers and an active member of the Association of Black Social Workers. Winnie mentors social workers seeking licensure with the Nova Scotia College of Social Work and is a director on the National Board of Big Brothers and Sisters, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, where she continues to serve as a big sister to a little guy for the past 2 years. Winnie works hard at employing an Afrocentric theoretical perspective and a critical race analysis, CRA, in everything she does, in her full-time employment, her teaching assignments, and reflecting on lived experiences. Welcome. John R. Sillaboy. John R. Zono, Mi'kmaq, from the Millbrook Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. John works in social and cultural development, health and education policy, and research and community development for Atlantic Indigenous communities, especially for Two Spirits and Indigenous LGBTQIA. John collaborates on regional and national projects and promotes Indigenous perspectives in health and research. He is a consultant in First Nations educational governance, two-eyed seeing approach in education and research, post-secondary education needs in areas that impact the health, well-being, and educational outcomes of youth in Two Spirits. He has led initiatives for curriculum development and cultural safety training in post-secondary education at Mount St. Vincent, Dalhousie University, and McGill University. John is a co-founder of the Wabanaki Two Spirit Alliance, W2SA, which helps to build support and awareness of Two Spirits in Mi'kma'ki and Canada. He is currently in his doctoral studies at McGill University. His research is about gender, sexuality, and sex, and the terms 2SLGBTQIA to build positive cultural identity through language revitalization that reflects the diversity of gender identities and sexuality of Mi'kmaq and Indigenous youth in a contemporary context. He's a member of my band and a really great friend to me and many. Welcome, John. Lydia Moingo. Lydia Moingo is a PhD student in Dalhousie University's clinical psychology program. She has published research on the partner influences on alcohol use and is currently preparing a dissertation on the healthy immigrant effect on substance use. She aspires to be a psychologist and has experience working with children and adolescents in community mental health settings. Welcome, Lydia. I look forward to hearing this. Naomi Bird. Naomi Bird is a Cree, two-spirited person from Montreal Lake First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. They are a Dalhousie student in sustainability and urban planning with a minor in Indigenous studies and community organizer currently residing in Jabuktuk. Their organizing, research, and personal interests include Indigenous lands, sovereignty, Two-Spirit identities, and language reclamation. Welcome, Naomi. Tyler Simmons. Tyler Simmons is a film director, TEDx speaker, and an entrepreneur who openly speaks about his experience with depression and anxiety to inspire others. Tyler Simmons is a public speaker and filmmaker who speaks openly about his experience living with mental illness, reminding people that recovery is possible and emphasizing the importance of vulnerability, mindfulness, and achieving your flow state through creativity and meditation. Tyler's is clearly a message that resonates with many. In 2016, the Huffington Post named him one of the 10 inspirational people under 30 you should be following on Twitter. Twitter is where Tyler engages with over 35,000 followers. Through his advocacy work, Tyler aims to inspire others. Tyler has found success in film with his award-winning piece, In My Mind, which is just one of the many artistic projects he has displayed over the years. Through his many challenges, Tyler is inspiring people in Nova Scotia, across Canada, and around the world with the power of vulnerability, creative fearlessness, and authenticity. I'd like to once again welcome all to the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and also thank you for speaking on a subject, mental health, that many people are reluctant to speak about. And I really, having had so much experience with my family and friends myself in this area. I just am so happy that people are beginning to speak about it and normalize it, so it's not some kind of disease out there. Not that diseases are bad, but So thank you, everyone. And I'd like to welcome you again. And I'm looking forward to this evening. So first, we will ask our first speaker, and I'm going back up. Sorry about it's Winnie Grant, our adjunct professor at Dalhousie School of Social Work. Winnie gets to be the first.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight, and thank you for the ability to talk on this very important topic when we're talking about racism and the impact that it has on our mental health. I want to also begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people, and I would like to acknowledge the shoulders in which I stand on and those who have come before me, my ancestors. As you will see from the PowerPoint slide, I did try to create a bit of an agenda, recognizing that I only have 10 minutes, and so this is a huge topic to speak about in 10 minutes. So it will probably be from a high-level perspective, but please, if there are questions that you have, I'd be more than happy to answer those. So I wanted to set the context in terms of racism and the impact that it has, and also wanted to just share that the information tonight has been work that I have been processing since I completed my master's thesis, which was entitled The Evolution of African Consciousness, the Impact that it has on our identity formation as people of African descent. With that being said, that thesis was done in 1997, and it's now 2020. And unfortunately, the content is still relevant today. And so I wanted to begin by looking at what are some of the definitions. And I thought it's important to have definitions because we tend to interchange those definitions and we tend to call them racism. I also want to look at what the connection to mental health and racism is, and how does healing look? What does that look like for individuals? So the first slide here that you see, it speaks to the fact that I am because we are. And I use that because it's important for us to recognize that as a community, regardless of where we live in the diaspora, we are all impacted by racism despite our level of consciousness. We may feel that some of us have a deeper understanding of racism than the others, but regardless of where we live, regardless of our family composition, regardless of our financial bank account, we are all still impacted by racism. You'll see when we go to the next slide, when we talk about definition, and these are the definitions that tend to become interchanged. And so when we look at prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes, those sometimes people will call prejudice, discrimination, and discrimination prejudice. So I wanted to set the tone by just sort of define what they are. So what is prejudice? And when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about a preconceived thought. We're talking about how it is that we see things and how we perceive them, and so we are prejudging. When we talk about discrimination, we're talking about the action that's related to that preconceived thought. And oftentimes people will say somebody is discriminating when they mean that they're being prejudiced, or they'll say that they're prejudiced when they mean that they're discriminating. And stereotypes is the characteristics that are given to a group of people by society. And so there are certain populations that would have specific characteristics that are associated with them. Trauma, when we look at trauma, we're looking at an event that occurred that we do not have control over, that we can't determine that it's going to happen at this particular moment. And in the case of racism, we are not able to, when we have acts of racism or the violence of racism, we're not able to say that that racism is going to happen at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday or Thursday evening. So when we're talking about trauma, and a lot of the violence or the impact of racism is traumatic. And so when we talk about racism in relation to trauma, we're talking about it as a complex trauma. And racism, a definition of racism that I use is that racism is the oppression of a race of people. And the difference between racism and prejudice, discrimination, is that racism has an element of power. So when we talk about who can be prejudiced, who can discriminate, we all can be prejudiced, we all can carry prejudicial thoughts, we all can have acts of discrimination, but we can't all be racist. And the reason why we can't be racist is because people of African descent cannot oppress another group. We don't have the economic power to be able to do that. And then the last definition that I just want to touch base on is around mental health. And when we're talking about mental health, we're talking about our psychological well-being, our state of mind. And so when we move through the next stage of the next slide, actually, what I'd like to do is talk about the impact of racism. And on this slide, you'll see that I have in the center two beautiful little babies. And I use this diagram just to help as a visual for folks to understand the impact that racism has. And so when we talk about stereotypes, we're talking about how we are perceived as people of African descent. So some of the stereotypes that are associated with people of African descent is that we're angry, that we're violent, that we're loud, that fathers are absent, that we are poor, we're lazy, we're drug dealers, uneducated, that we have lots of children, we're single parents, and that we live in public housing. And the catalyst to the work that I did in 1997 was because of a stereotype that a young boy in grade 2 shared with me. I was doing some work with the Association of Black Social Workers when I was doing my placement. And when I was talking to these children, these young children in school and about their behavior, and that's part of the reason why we were at the school with the Association of Black Social Workers. And this young male had shared an experience where he and two other males were in the hallway, and out of respect for the teacher who was walking up this narrow hallway, had moved to the side and their backs were against the lockers. And instead of the teacher saying thank you, what the teacher said to these young males were, "Oh, what are you boys doing? Getting ready for a police lineup." And so at a very early age, our children understand that we are seen different in society as other children who do not look like us. And so the next slide shows that as we move through society, we are interfacing with different institutions. Can I just get the next slide put up, please? So those institutions, and so when we talk about where does racism exist? So we know that racism exists everywhere in society. So whether it's in housing, in our education, our employment, military, within the government, in restaurants, financial institutions, museums, so wherever it is that we navigate within society, we are at risk of experiencing incidents of racism. And so what happens with that, though, is that we, because of that experience that we are subjected to, it plays on our psyche. And when we're talking about the psychological impact that racism has on us as a Black community, the next slide shows that there are a number of psychological responses. And so we oftentimes, whether we're conscious of it or we're not conscious of it, we will become anxious, we may become depressed, we may become overwhelmed, we may have a lack of motivation, we may have low self-esteem, become self-destructive, we may hate who we are as persons of African descent, we might not continue to try at activities, we might withdraw, we might conform to the way, we might abuse ourselves. So there's a number of psychological responses as a result of the impact of racism. And so when we're talking about that, oftentimes we are not cognizant of how racism is impacting our lives. We're not cognizant as to how it has shaped our vocational direction. We're not cognizant of the opportunities that we may want to take, but we choose not to take because we may feel, why bother? They're not going to give us the job anyway. So when I say that in the next slide, what that demonstrates, and this is taken from my thesis, and so what that demonstrates is that if we were as a people of African descent, born in Africa, in a non-racist society where we had models, role models around us, where we were able to see ourselves working in positions of power, then we would be able to, a lot of those psychological responses that I talked about would not necessarily be as deeply rooted within our sense of consciousness. If we could just go back to that slide again, I want to acknowledge that there are times that everybody becomes anxious. And so I might be anxious if I was to go up on the 25th floor of a building and look over the balcony. That may cause me some anxiety if I'm afraid of heights. But the fact that I can change that and prevent myself from doing that activity by just not going up there. However, there are times when you look at the green inner circle that those institutions are institutions that we would either need to participate in, for example, like healthcare, or needing to go to a bank, or just wanting to go to a restaurant, and are at risk of being subjected to incidents of racism. So as we move back to that other slide, I just want to show that this is an example. If we did not have to contend with those psychological responses, then we would then, our sense of identity would just ooze out of us. Whereas you can see from the next slide that is there, that our identity tends to be disjointed, and it becomes a lot of work for us as individuals to begin to actively and consciously put ourselves in places where we can then affirm our sense of identity. Just keeping in time, knowing that I only have 10 minutes and that I'm at that mark, I just want to quickly go to the next slide and to ask, what does healing look like? And when we talk about healing, I think there really needs to be an appreciation for who we are. There needs to be a level of critical self-reflection around how have we been impacted by racism, understanding the terminology of racism, but also understanding that we all have been impacted by racism. And it does become quite emotional when we start to peel back some of those layers to look at how, when I was a young teen, I may have wanted to be a doctor, but chose not to do that career because I felt that white people would not want to come to me as a doctor, or felt that I would compromise my career to do something totally different because I felt that that was safer. And so when we talk about healing, we're talking about understanding the impact of racism, talking about trying to reverse all of those psychological pieces that was put on that slide, enjoying who we are as people of African descent, loving ourselves because we are of African descent, proudly demonstrating and demonstrating who we are as proud people of African descent, and also extending a hand to reach out to others to help to bring them along and to engage in those conversations about how racism has impacted us. So with that being said, I know that I'm out of time. So if we just go to our next slide, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity and welcome questions.
Thank you, Winnie. Lovely. There were so many times I was just nodding my head because so much of what you have been speaking about is validating and very relevant to many of us. And I'd like to thank you. We're going to have questions at the end. So we're going to go on now to John R. Syllaboy. John, are you ready?
Indeed. Olotio.
Hey.
Holiday de Molo, Megide de Molo, Pexnudio, Aimudio, La Juda, the seminar. Thank you, everyone. I'm proud that we're all here to share some of this knowledge, but also very glad to be here with you and to share some of the understandings I have around racism and how it affects our well-being, our health, and our mental health specifically. But I won't go into much detail about the effects of racism on us. There's a lot of information on that out there, but I do want to highlight a couple of different things on here with the use of PowerPoint. So I have the first PowerPoint that's going to come online. There's dimensions of racism that we understand as Indigenous people and as Mi'kmaq. And I wanted to use a symbol that is representative of us to understand how it is that we're looking at racism. And understanding the fact that racism has, like I said, various dimensions. So it goes from the self, and it goes to the family, and then the next being the community, the nation as in First Nation, and then it goes to a societal level, and then to the actual national level. So there's all kinds of ways that racism can be portrayed. I'm going to look at the individual sense of accountability that one has to deal with racism. So one of the things that I've learned in the experience as an Indigenous person is that intergenerational racism exists. There is such thing as something that I've been taught is to survive in the face of racism. I would have to understand that racism has been passed down as a way of people to dominate others, and Winnie already spoke to those. But the point being is that as a person who's been experiencing racism at different levels, I've had to learn the tools of survival as well. So that generational and intergenerational racism that may exist also affects that person, not only the personhood of a person, but also the nationhood of like a First Nation group altogether, like the Mi'kmaq, or Indigenous people all across Canada altogether. We know that for a fact that there are ways that we're trying to look at racism and address it. An example is, how is one accountable to your own sense of racism? So I wanted to look at the self-reflective process of dealing with racism as myself. So who's accountable for my own racism, for example? So that's one of the things that our elders make us aware about is, you know, trying to understand that racism can affect the spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental sides to your well-being and your wellness. It throws off your balance. If one part is affected, the rest of the other parts are affected. So when you have that sense of unbalance in your well-being, of course, it's going to affect the rest of your well-being as a spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental balanced person. So when you look at, for example, the spiritual side, where do my biases come from? Where do I learn them? Is it part of my belief system? And is it within my culture? Is it something that I learned at home, for example? So that spiritual side, you have to you know, reflect on your own belief systems and see how it is that you want to approach that. And it's a very sensitive and very, it's a journey that our elders would say that you have to go through to understand what it is you're doing as a potentially a racist person. And on the physical side, for example, I would say that am I visibly demonstrating racism out there? Are there actions that I do that are racist? Am I teaching this overtly or unconsciously? You know, are there words that I'm saying, or are there actions or movements? Is my body language saying that I'm racist? Are there parts that I'm not conscious of that are physically demonstrating my sense of racism? So that can exist as well. So the next dimension, of course, is the emotional part. So the emotional part, how may I affect others with my actions? And what is it that I have to do and say? Is it something that I do and say? Or is it something that I even avoid from saying that may be affecting the race, like the well-being of another person because of a racist characteristic? Am I contributing to, for example, fight against racism, or am I a standby? Like a standby meaning bystander is what I'm trying to say. And letting it happen by saying, you know what, just mind my own business, you know. And the mental side, of course, we have to look at, you know, right down to the core of where your own sense of racism may come from. Are my thoughts racist? Am I judging people based on what we learn all throughout our life is to be discriminatory about things that we know we like and we don't like? But then am I, you know, carrying those discriminatory actions into a prejudice and a bias that turns into a racist potential? process? Am I sparking racism and racist thoughts in myself? So when we look at this process of trying to look at your own sense of racism, it's a big responsibility. So our elders in our culture, and the Mi'kmaq, for example, we have to look at this whole process from various levels. Winnie made mention that, power is linked with racism as well. But racism may exist even without us knowing. And I may not have that power, but still, that racism may still exist. So in the next slide, we wanted to look at, I want to explore how healing the self, and if I heal the self, then we start addressing the self to the family, from the family to the community, community to the nation, as in the First Nation, and then to the societal level, and et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to share what I've been taught as ways of addressing racism and trying to outwardly manifest it so that we integrate this into a societal norm and a value that's within our cultural ways of being. For example, a lot of indigenous cultures across many different parts of the world have something similar as the sacred teachings. In Mi'kmaq, and for us, we have love, honesty, humility, respect, truth, patience, and wisdom. We use these as guiding principles of how we want to act and how we want to address our own ways of conducting ourselves, the self, with the family and the community and the nation. So these are very important spiritual guides that we need to address. So if I guide myself with what elders say and use the sacred teachings, for example, then we start working towards that. And that's part of an important process of doing your own work. You're working on yourself. You're trying to get yourself better. There's no culture in the world that teaches hate as the first principle of any culture. We always start from love, because a baby is what you look at when they're born. How could you hate this person, right? It's something that you always feel love for. You even feel this love for a baby that you don't know. And that's an incredible sentiment that we use, and we grow from that. And if we use that as a principal value of the 7 sacred teachings, then it reflects on the rest, and it grows. It just expands as we go. Then a physical part of that healing process has to be the implementing of actions. Actions that are tangible, something that we could see, something that we could grasp, something that's not abstract, but that's something that we could implement into an action for the society, for myself, and for everybody else around me. So what we use here in Nova Scotia, for example, is the importance of using treaty education. The concept of we are all treaty people is extremely important, because we understand that we are a collective. We're a collective working together. It's a collective of kingship. It's a collective of responsibility and a consciousness that we all work together, and one can't survive without the other. With the treaty education profile that we've been working with, the idea is that we collaborate together to move forward. And that's the same thing as dealing with this racism issue. The emotional and mental parts as well, we go on with those that show that providing supports is a process of decolonization. Winnie alluded to that. We also have to make sure that we have a process of reawakening, relearning, resurgence. But on the mental health side, the mental process side, we have to understand it's a multidimensional process that is interconnected between the 4 realms that we're looking at. And if there's an imbalance in one, it will throw the other ones off. And we also have to understand that for that racism healing process to take place, it has to be supported. We have to provide supports for the person that is going through their own understanding of why they're racist, but also we have to provide supports for the resurgence of a new awakening of going into education and using that treaty sense, for example, and those 7 sacred teachings to move forward with. So that turns into a societal value. So those are the parts that I want to raise for this panel.
Well, I love to hear from you, John. And when you were talking about looking at yourself and asking yourself all these questions if you are doing the right things, it reminded me of one of the things, I don't know why it struck me so funny, but Merdina used to say to me, Merdina Marshall, our elder of Escasoni, she used to say, well, you just have to go around like I do and go and be with yourself, walk with yourself and talk to yourself and, you know, just figure out what's going on with you. And I just always loved that visual. Yeah. Well, Alan, and we're going on next. I have to go. Yeah. Okay. I have to go back to my screen. Sorry about that. I'm supposed to be, you know, I am a filmmaker and I'm supposed to know how to do this technology, but I think I was one of the very first people in the Mi'kmaq community to get an email. So, you know, I go far back. I mean, not to get an email, but to use Mi'kmaq because no one had used it yet for my email. So it's a long time ago and I should know better now how to use this new technology. Now we're going to hear from Lydia Moyingo. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And welcome, Lydia, and thank you for sharing your words with us tonight.
Hi, everyone. Just going to get my screen shared here. Please give me a moment. Oops. Sorry. Can you see my... Okay. I am just going to... Sorry. Give me one moment, please. There. Can you see? Is that good? Okay, great. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me.
I can see it, so that's all we need, right?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm incredibly honored. So I'm hoping to talk more about the academic context because that is the world that I operate in, and that's what I can speak on today. So as you've already heard about me, I'm currently doing my PhD in clinical psychology at Dal. I'm very passionate about mental health. Research-wise, I'm interested in the cultural context of substance use and in immigrant substance use. So as a clinician in training, I want to set a little goal for the remainder of this talk and the remainder of this forum. And I hope that we can all go through this process. This is my goal. I hope that we could feel a little bit uncomfortable today. Why? Because racism is uncomfortable, pain and trauma is uncomfortable, mental health difficulties are uncomfortable. But I hope that through that uncomfortableness, through that sense of empathy for people's pain, that can lead us all into reflection. What have been your experiences with racism? Or maybe you haven't experienced that. Why? What have been your experiences with mental health? Have you benefited from or even thrived in the same environments that have left Black communities wounded? And I hope that this reflection compels you to feel a sense of urgency to act, to be compelled to feel a part of the solution. Because I don't know if you're aware right now, but we are in a historic moment and there's so many opportunities to be a part of the solution. You don't want to look back and say that I did nothing. So I'm being trained under a scientist practitioner model. That means I care about the science, I care about data, but I also care about the stories behind the science. So I'm hoping to show you what the research says, but I'm also going to read some stories from real people about their real experiences of racism within academia, within the workforce. So hopefully it shouldn't come as a surprise that racism comes in many flavors. It can be overt experiences, such as hearing racial slurs, verbal insults, offensive comments, and student evaluations, for example. It can be covert, so it's not necessarily out in the open. It could be microaggressions, differences in pay, biases that lead to fewer Black academics being hired, promoted, or placed in positions of leadership. It could be a hostile environment where only certain types of people seem to be respected or called upon in meetings. And these experiences affect relationships with coworkers, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. So that's your own belief in your own ability to succeed. So studies of workplace discrimination have demonstrated clear relationships between discrimination and symptoms of psychiatric disorders. So that includes depression, anxiety, PTSD, and more. And for some, these can actually turn into actual clinical diagnoses. And not only is dealing with these mental health symptoms enough, we know that there's a clear link between mental health and physical health. So we can't leave that out of the equation. So discrimination has also been linked to poor physical health conditions, such as hypertension, headaches, stomach ulcers, back problems, etc. And here I'd like to note that in some cultures, individuals place greater emphasis on the physical symptoms of distress instead of the mental health symptoms. And that could be in part due to the stigma attached to mental health. So you might have someone complain about headaches and difficulty sleeping, and maybe that's a better way to really talk about their mental health difficulties. So they might not tell you that they're depressed. So we cannot forget about physical conditions as well. Lastly, research has shown that experiences of workplace discrimination also has implications on job dissatisfaction, and job burnout and job turnover. So now just imagine the interaction between racism, mental health, physical health, and job dissatisfaction. All these things can also have implications on sleep quality, concentration, and just job performance. So I could cite papers for hours, but nothing is more powerful than real stories from real people. If you're on Twitter, I urge you to follow the hashtag #BlackInTheIvory. This is co-founded by Dr. Shard Davis and Miss Joy Woods. You will see countless stories of Black academics and their experiences of racism. I'd like to read a few. So here's one, some personal news. I've left my grad program at UCLA. So before we even talk about job turnover, we have to first jump through the hoops to get to the job. So here we have a grad student who ended up leaving a very prestigious program at a prestigious school like UCLA. And that just shows that racism is a loss for everyone. It's not just the individual who's hurting, it's the entire university that hurts, because that's a loss of diverse ideas, research, friendship, contributions, and more. Next. No, my career wasn't handed to me because I am Black. I promise you that that's not how this works. I earned every bit of what I accomplished. So here's an example of Black people feeling the need they need to prove why they're even there. And that undermines their accomplishments. Here's another example. Black in the Ivory is finding out that for 18 months, I was being paid less than my colleagues who was doing the exact same role as me, even though I had more years of experience and academic qualifications. So just an example of how there can be potential differences in pay. Here's another one. In the 8 schools I attended in K-12, 4.5 years of undergrad and 6 years of grad school, I've never had a Black teacher. As a TA/instructor for undergraduate and master's, I was very aware that this might be the first and only time these students have a Black instructor. So here is an example of people feeling the pressure that they are representing an entire people group. And I would argue that this person's probably doing a lot of unpaid labor in terms of mentorship and being a role model for students, which are all great things. But if this person is the only Black instructor that some people realize, that's a lot of pressure to be putting on one person. Here's one that's really relevant to today's discussion. I've never had a Black woman psychologist mentor or clinical supervisor. So this only shows, the importance of representation, because you can't be what you can't see. But also this shows that this person is missing out on diversity in terms of their teaching, their training, and styles, techniques, and experiences that they can learn from. So it really affects the entire institution. Now, we're going to get a little personal here. I mean, we're here to talk, right? There's an Instagram page called Discrimination at Dal that is frankly very hard to read, to get through, but it's essential because racism is happening right here, right now to real people, and these stories deserve to be heard. So here's the first one. I haven't told anyone this story before, but in my first year of university, I was the only Black person on my floor in Risley Hall, and I frequently overheard my neighbors referring to me as the floor-lead Negro or variations of the N-word. One time I was in the bathroom stall and overheard them talking about how they were afraid of going near me because they were afraid of being sexually assaulted. And that was what totally broke me. So here we can see that this overt racism is incredibly distressing. And this person hasn't felt comfortable telling anyone else, which is a huge problem. And the fact that this happened in the past shows you that these experiences have a way of sticking with people. And that can stick with someone for years and continue to impact them and impact their mental health. Here's another one. As a Black student after 4 years at Dal, I was left with so much trauma from all the racism I experienced. I went out to address how racism on campus affects racialized students. I had to go through intense therapy and help to regain my sense of self. You can see I worked hard and paid tuition to come out with a degree in mental health issues from being in a toxic environment. So I share this in order to illustrate the impact of repeated racism and how it takes an entire environment, an entire culture to change in order to create healthier environments for Black students. I'll share one more. Discrimination at Dal doesn't just stop at undergrad. Whether it is from faculty, other students, or even security, the microaggressions never end. Black graduate students are passed over for scholarship, called names, ignored, harassed, and even followed around. The university is a horribly unsafe and hostile place for Black students at all levels, and we can't speak out. Not really. It'll get attached to us, which will affect our career prospects and our ability to do our work. The fear is so great that I'm wording this submission to ensure that it won't be tied to me. It's taken my self-esteem and sense of joy for the work I'm doing, and now I hate it here. So I'm showing this one, which is really difficult to read. It shows the fear of speaking out because of potential consequences. Students are already in vulnerable situations, and adding on racial identities to that only makes these students more vulnerable. But I'm hoping that the student is watching and that they would feel comfortable reaching out to me and that they can see that their voice matters and that they deserve to feel proud of their work, just like any other student, and that we're going to do something to help them. And I share all this because I know that we can do better. I believe that Dal and other universities have the power to do better, and it starts here by sharing stories. So, where do we go from here? The first thing is to continue to connect and share your stories, either anonymously or with friends, with mentors. It can be a really isolating experience to be one of the only racialized people in your workplace. So it's important that we seek out more opportunities to connect with each other, because that's really important to healing. And healing can look different for different people. It could be mental health support for past traumas, support groups, meditation, spiritual connections, all those things. And after we've healed, we must act. That means holding institutions accountable. That means different things for each people. So if, for example, if you're a Black person and you've had to survive in those racist environments, I would tell you that just simply existing and thriving in your environment is an act of resistance. If you are someone in the position of power, I urge you right now to listen to these stories and have these conversations, because you also have the power to be part of the change. So there's a desperate need for more Black healers. As a group, I'm sure we can come up with multiple reasons why, but I'll just present one that's based off of research and reading that I've done as part of my PhD degree. So we know that therapy works for a lot of people. We know that there are many different types of approaches and methods, manuals, and surprisingly, these have really similar efficacy rates. Virtual therapy can be just as effective as in-person therapy, for example, which is great given a global pandemic. What's been puzzling is that we don't know all the specific reasons why all these different techniques work. So there's been a shift in psychology to focus more on the common factors across therapy. So it's really good that there's so many options for people and you can find what works best for you, but it's the common factors that really matter. And one huge common factor that has a big role of how, does the success of treatment is a therapeutic alliance. And that is the bond between the therapist and the client. A strong therapeutic alliance is essential. It's a strong predictor of treatment success, treatment engagement, and adherence. It can facilitate empathy and honesty between between the therapist and the client. And research has shown that on average, minority clients have a preference for therapists of the same race. And in some studies, not all of them, some studies they report stronger therapeutic alliances when the race of the therapist and the client is matched. So knowing that alliance is important to therapy as a whole, it's an undeniable fact that there needs to be more Black therapists available so that everyone can have the right to choose the therapist that they need. For some people, it might not even matter. But for some, it might be the only way that they can seek help and the only way that they would feel comfortable. So here's my call to action. I'm part of a working group of graduate students in psychology across Canada who share these concerns and want to significantly increase the diversity of mental health professionals. The group wrote an open letter to the Canadian Psychological Association, CPA, that's incredibly detailed and has many action points. So I really recommend people to read that and share it with their circles. I've also offered, along with a colleague of mine, to mentor Black youth and young Black adults who are interested in mental health fields, because there's no time to waste and the need is so large. So if you know someone who's interested in psychology, please have them reach out to me and I'd love to help them. I want to leave us with some resources. For those who are Black in academia, I recommend the Academics for Black Lives website. for those in academia and have positions of power, please read this free article, How Academia Should Respond to Racism. And there's some support groups for Black folks. So there's Therapy for Black Girls, The Village, and Ethel's Club. And lastly, there's a blacktherapistList.com, which lists some of the Black therapists in Canada. So my goal of the session was for us to go through this cycle, actually. So it's not just a one-way street. You might feel uncomfortable. You might reflect and you act. And after you've done your act, start the cycle again, because we have a lot of work to do. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to discussing after.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That everything is just resonating with me. I think one of the things that you said, that we all have that real difficulty when you have to get some help, but that stigma about, the psychologist or the counselor is so relevant in this society that it's hard to take that first step. So I really liked what you told me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck to you.
I'll need it. Thanks.
Okay, Naomi Bird. I like to welcome you. I don't know you very well, so I'm happy to get to know Naomi.
Hi.
Hi.
Tansei Naomi Bird, Sigason, Montreal Lake, Equa, Saskatoon, Ochinia, Equa, Jubuktuk, Nuikin, Miigwech. Hi everyone, my name is Naomi Bird. I was raised in Saskatoon and belong to the Montreal Lake Cree Nation, and I'm currently a visitor living in Mi'kmaq. I'm about to start my 5th year at Dalhousie, and I'm a community organizer. This evening, I want to talk about the current social justice movement, the idea of COVID as an apocalypse, and how to be an ally for Indigenous and BIPOC mental health. So right now on social media, we're seeing a surge of interest and discussion on the Black Lives Matter movement and interlinking topics, including police brutality, abolition, anti-racist work, and how white supremacy is structured within our institutions, organizations, and lives. People are uplifting the voices and perspectives of Black, Indigenous, and other POC educators. Reading lists are being made for individuals interested in learning histories beyond the Eurocentric narratives we've been force-fed since elementary school. There's an abundance of information circling on what allyship looks like. New people are showing up, both virtually and at rallies and demonstrations. It feels as if we are on the precipice of real long-term equitable change, but it also feels as if everything will go back to normal, which is back to upholding white supremacy. It feels as if I'm holding my breath, waiting, and it's important to note that I can't speak to what my Black kin are feeling and experiencing. However, I think it's really important to question, why now? Why did it take a global pandemic and people being home and more engaged on social media to realize that racial inequalities and systems of oppression need to be challenged? Why are we now looking to businesses and institutions to show commitments to anti-racist work? In 2020, it's a privilege to be learning about rather than experiencing racism. As an Indigenous person, I can't step away from this work because I deal with racism and microaggressions weekly. I have to use my gifts to help uplift my community, which to me includes educating others about Indigenous realities. Something I really want to emphasize is that BIPOC folks are tired and traumatized right now. And I'm gonna speak to this with a bit of a story. So earlier this year, Indigenous sovereignty was trending in Canada. Land defenders and allies across the nation were blocking railways to stand in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en Nation, whose land was being invaded by RCMP and Coastal GasLink, set upon building a pipeline. I was in my 4th year, taking a few classes, organizing events for Indigenous students, and involved in a few campus societies. But I dropped everything to organize and attend solidarity actions here in Jubuktuk. There was an energy at the rallies that I've never experienced before. Once again, or I guess for the first time for those of you who believe in linear time, it felt as if we were on the precipice of change. So many people were invested in learning about Indigenous sovereignty and dedicated to supporting the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I've only read about the Idle No More movement and the Oka crisis, but in my mind, I thought maybe this is what people felt like back then. If everyone was just to keep on organizing, if we just kept teaching more and more people about colonialism and present day land dispossession by the state, then things could get better. If we could just convince enough people of our humanity, they might pressure institutions to enact long-lasting change. There's one rail shutdown in particular that sticks out in my mind. It was cold and people were dancing to keep warm, but when I asked if people would want to stay overnight, I received a resounding yes, and I was floored. I think at most teach-ins, actions, or demonstrations, people come for a little bit, they learn, and then they leave. Allies can engage with Indigenous sovereignty for a couple hours and then return to normalcy. They can leave it in a way that Indigenous people never have or will be able to do. I burnt myself out organizing. I started disassociating in class, not understanding why I was sitting in a classroom when it felt like the Indigenous revolution was happening. I felt that nothing I could do would ever be enough and that I was living in two realities. In one reality, my kin were fighting for survival, fighting to live as Indigenous people, to maintain our cultures, lands, and languages. What happened to the Wet'suwet'en Nation was a test of reconciliation. If unceded land recognized by both Indigenous and Canadian law was invaded, how could other nations, including my own, have hope? If the media was prevented from documenting militarized violence on Indigenous matriarchs, how could we ever expect the calls to action from the MMIWG2S final inquiry to ever be implemented? In my other reality, it was business as usual, except for those pesky NDNs who were blocking the rails and hurting the economy. Stereotypes were animated to position my kin as domestic terrorists, and my university, while condemning the violence in BC, continued to invest its endowment fund in fossil fuel companies, including the parent company of Coastal GasLink. I felt gaslit by dominant society, trying to explain my Indigenous reality and being told I was asking too much. I was too sensitive, or straight up just wrong. I took a step back from organizing to heal. So I've heard people describe COVID as foreshadowing to or the beginning of an apocalypse. And mental health experts express how lessened productivity, worsened or newly developed mental health issues, and other emotional and physical changes stem from our bodies responding to the stress of the pandemic. The stress manifests differently between individuals and of course disproportionately impacts low-income and racialized folks. Indigenous people have been surviving an apocalypse since colonization started. To me, the pandemic is akin to how I feel in my daily life, scared of the unknown, fearful that the future I imagine for my nation, relations, and kin will not be possible, wanting to retreat to my bed, dealing with my worsening mental health, and organizing and working for change when everything feels so uncertain. This isn't a new idea. Indigenous academics and writers have been speaking on the idea of living through genocide and apocalypse for years. Our ancestors have survived being torn from their homelands, sent to residential schools in attempts to eliminate language and thus our cultures. And at these schools and through various government policies, European ideas of government, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism were implanted within communities and to varying degrees remain self-sustaining in the present day. And we are currently living through an ongoing genocide of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. The structures of oppression, along with contemporary and lasting impacts of historical colonization, lead us to experience higher rates of suicide, racial and gendered violence, mental disorders, and poverty. So there's a few lessons in this narrative that I've shared that I'd just like to go through. So the first is that in moments when there's a lot of discussion on social justice, your BIPOC friends and colleagues are likely holding their breath, wondering how long you will advocate for our humanity. We need you to commit to the long haul, even though your positionality enables you to leave movements that are not about your personal liberation. I think COVID has offered individuals an opportunity to be at home and reflect on anti-racist practices, to challenge their internalized racism, and to learn about history from a non-Eurocentric lens. I need you to keep doing this work, even when Black Lives Matter or the greater social justice movement isn't trending. Second, find a way to do this work sustainably. Take time for self-care. I burnt out organizing. I wanted immediate change and I need it for my future children. However, change is incremental, learning itself takes time, and we're not going to become anti-racist and perfect allies overnight. In fact, I don't think there is a perfect ally, and that's okay. You'll make mistakes, others will call you in, and this is a lifelong journey. Seeing how you benefit from white supremacy and other structures of oppression is daunting and emotional. Allow yourself time to unlearn. Forgive yourself for taking so long to get here, but vow to stay now that you've made it. Figure out how to be an activist in your daily life. I don't think this should be a job for the select few, but something each individual takes on, respecting their own fluctuating capacities. And lastly, I want you to think about this work as not only enabling greater community and global change, but as a harm reduction practice in your interpersonal relationships. I carry intergenerational, historic, and lifetime trauma. When people do not know Indigenous history, are not critical of stereotypes, or otherwise know very little of our realities, they've hurt me through actions, inactions, and words. I'm triggered by individual and systemic microaggressions and racism on a weekly basis. I do not want to point out that you're being racist or insensitive. I do not want to have to always be correcting for the Eurocentrism in contemporary education, and I certainly do not want to build an academic career off of explaining how settler colonialism has caused pain to various nations across Turtle Island. There is so much joy, resistance, and love within Indigenous existence. We are powerful, hold important knowledges, and are more than just racialized, traumatized people. However, I found this reality is hidden because so many settlers do not yet know the pains of settler colonialism. I find myself having to learn and dwell in Indigenous pain for my advocacy and academic work. I point out how systems of oppression cause my kin and I pain because this is not common knowledge. What I'm asking is that you consider learning about Indigenous, Black, and other POC realities and histories as an act for caring for our mental health. Learn about our history so we do not have to call upon historical traumas to explain present-day inequities. Learn about residential school so I do not have to explain it while trying to cry, thinking about my mushroom and his experience impacting my life and the struggles I face in reclaiming my language. Learn about Indigenous connections to land to understand that a pipeline forced into the ground is akin to assault upon my mother. Learn about the pain of Indigenous reality so that I can immerse myself in the joy of Indigenous existence. Thank you.
Walalan. Gwitch. Miigwech. Thank you. I think one of the first things you said is I find myself holding my breath and waiting and praying that they will. I mean, you didn't say praying, I said. I am the same way, just saying, is this going to come and go like all of the reports and like, you know, everybody's so hyped up about something and then the next thing comes. And it's funny, I completely forgot about the blocking of the railroads and hurting the economy, because right when, just as it was ending, up came the violence in America, and then COVID, and yeah, that's going to happen. It just kind of went. I mean, we were successful, but we forgot. So I'd like to thank you. And when I hear the younger generation like yourself speaking in this way, I am so hopeful. You're carrying a load and you're carrying it forward from all of the work others have done, and I'm really proud of that. So, Walalan. Now we're going to go down. I wanted to say, and I was thought, oh, maybe John might say, your bird, the name bird is Gypchich in Mi'kmaq. So I was thinking about you as that beautiful bird, Gypchich. Lastly, but not least, we have Tyler Simmons, and Tyler, sorry, is has part of my heart because I'm also a filmmaker and a storyteller, and I was a TEDx speaker 2. Safety Feiler, and welcome.
Just 1 second. Okay, so I'm Tyler Simmons. I'm a film director, public speaker, and entrepreneur. I'm from North Preston, which is the largest Black community in Canada. Growing up, great childhood, great parents, amazing family. And I often tell people that if you were to drive through North Preston, you just see a bunch of people wave at you. If your car were to break down, somebody's gonna come out and help you. You often see the driveways filled with cars, and it's because we're like a big family. This is something that often isn't portrayed in the media. We definitely have a history of the media portraying us as lesser, as where the criminals are, where all of the violence and gang activity happens. And a part of what I do with my storytelling, with my speaking, with my filmmaking, even with the clothing that I do, and a lot of it is to show people that that's not us. We're not just the stereotype that a lot of people think we are. Growing up, I had to deal with a lot of those different stereotypes because being in North Preston, you're around all of these people that look like you and that have similar values to you, and a lot of them my cousins. It's comfortable, and then you leave that community and you see that things are different. People ask you weird questions about where you're from. I get that a lot. Weird questions about your hair, weird questions about what type of music you listen to, and just having so many different stereotypes put on you. And even going through school, I remember having certain teachers recommend that I take on a smaller workload. I remember being treated differently in school because of where I was from and because of the color of my skin. And these things still happen today. It's very common in the Black community. We have to adjust to this white world. And the thing is, white people don't need to do that. It would be nice for them to try to adjust and think, oh, their culture is different from ours. So I'm going to try to accommodate that. I'm going to try to make them feel more comfortable. But immediately when I left North Preston, I remember I played hockey when I was a kid, and that was the first time that when I think back about it, I had to code switch. That's like changing the way that you carry yourself and the way that you talk, because you don't want people to think of you as this aggressive Black man. You don't want people to think of you as this uneducated Black man. And at this time, I was just a boy, though. I was like 10 years old, but these thoughts were coming to me like, oh, I have to carry myself in a certain way. When I would go to like a store, when I would go to school, when I would play sports, thinking, oh, I have to make sure that they know that I'm not a threat. And a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is focusing on what that can do to somebody. At such a young age, and you are already self-conscious about things, like almost every kid are insecure about things, and then you go out into the world and you are thinking, oh, people aren't going to accept me for who I am. And I grew up living with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety. And these ideas that I knew other people had of me and of my community and of people that looked like me, these ideas definitely contributed to my mental illness. It's really this, I think that it's really important for people to understand that racism can have a serious effect on our health, on our mental health, on our physical health, and it needs to be addressed. When I first went to see my doctor about my mental health, I remember how uncomfortable I felt because I didn't feel like I could say, oh, growing up feeling like I'm not accepted in certain spaces, like white spaces, or being treated a certain way, contributed to this depression and anxiety that I have. I didn't feel comfortable saying these things, which is why it's so important for there to be clinicians of color. And thankfully, I was able to find that. And this is trauma. Often people with trauma, they're not diagnosed with it, but they have it. And I just want to talk about the pandemic for a second and everything that's been going on. When the pandemic first happened, I was so anxious. I was really scared. And I know a lot of people were. Some people seemed to be okay, but I was really scared. And I immediately went into fight or flight. I was like, I have to conquer this, or I need to escape this. Like, fight this by becoming a better me and just work out all the time and just read all the time, become a better person, or I need to escape into like Netflix and just watch movies all day and get out of my head. And that's something that when tragedy happens, like that's something normal as humans that we go through. And while in this pandemic, I saw footage of what happened to George Floyd. I saw all of the killings happening in the world to people who look like me. And that same thing happened. I went into fight or flight. I was like, I have to do something about this, or I have to just escape from it and watch Netflix all day or something. And what I decided to do was have conversations about these things and to fight, to really try and fight these things. But it's hard because, you know, being a Black person and then seeing these things and living these different things and living through racism, seeing the amount of things happening in the world to people because they are Black. not just random things, but because they are Black, that has a huge effect on you. And I had to take a step back, and I had to remind myself, like, Tyler, you are dealing with trauma. And when dealing with trauma, you need to be compassionate to yourself. You need to take care of yourself. And so thankfully now I'm starting to get to that stage where I'm trying to heal myself. I think my time's about to be up, so I'll wrap it up. But I want to say what we can do. What we can do is we can heal ourselves. We can take a step away from all of the noise. We can, for myself, I had to take a step away from social media a lot. I still tweet, but I had to stay away from like Facebook and Instagram and get away from all of the noise and clear my mind and connect with those people that make you feel comfortable. And we're all in this together. So be there for one another. If you need to talk, reach out. There's nothing to be ashamed of. Thank you.
Sorry. Is it any better?
We seem to have some technical difficulties there, Kathy, so I can go ahead and do the Q&A. Great, thanks.
Can
well-
you hear me now? Sorry, I just want to thank them. I had both computer and my phone on. Thank you, Tyler. And you struck my heart when you said at 10 years old you had to think about this, and that is heartbreaking. And I want to thank you for speaking to us all. I think that COVID, the opportunities that has presented us and all of the unfortunate events and violent acts and all of that has happened, it's actually given us lots of opportunities to connect with one another and have that that lovely conversation. So, Malalan. Okay, sorry, Teresa, go ahead. Sandalace.
Fine. Thank you, Kathy, and thanks for moderating so far. I would also like to join Kathy in thanking the panelists. And we saw that the messages coming out were clear and consistent. And it was very powerful and I think educational to understand that the impact of racism and mental health is intergenerational. That was made clear, that it happens in similar and dissimilar ways between the two communities, the Black and Indigenous communities, and that it's also across boundaries between institutions like the university and society. So the questions that I'm going to ask the panelists can be grouped into certain ways in that we can address the issues in the communities and then move it back to Dalhousie and institutions like Dalhousie. So a question for John Siliboy. Can you tell us a little more about how treaty education in Nova Scotia addresses or decreases the impacts of racism against Indigenous people in Nova Scotia?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Great, thank you for that question. Treaty education is on a resurgence in Nova Scotia, but from the non-Indigenous side. the Indigenous side has always respected the fact that we've been basing our relationship with others outside of our Indigenous community and within the Indigenous community with other Indigenous people on a basis of treaty, meaning we are bound by a collective of action to move forward together, and respecting the inherent and Aboriginal rights and Indigenous rights of people and Mi'kmaq rights of people here. It's understood that we hadn't ceded our rights and our lands and what is coordinated as our cultural being and well-being of people in our area. In the last, and it's been a great learning opportunity as an Indigenous Mi'kmaq person to even have people that are reteaching us the concept of treaty education. Leaders such as, the person that really brought it to our attention and has lobbied greatly here is Jaime Battis, who is currently part of the Member of Parliament and led the voice of that treaty education to move forward as a provincial-wide mandate. Now it's becoming a thing in curricula, and it's becoming something that's being addressed in institutional systems in departmental levels, for example, in education and in health. So it's bringing a consciousness of the Indigenous and the Mi'kmaq in a provincial strategy as a highlight of what we should do between the relations of ourselves as a collective in Nova Scotia. So it addresses the principles of the we move together as a collective to address all these situations, including anything that has to do with racism. The current situation, for example, looking at the Cornwallis situation, really brought out that sense that we need to understand what our stand is with that and how we can move together to understand what we need to alleviate when it comes to those racist processes. And then what can we use with the educational platform to reteach people about these situations. It's a very proactive stance of by the Mi'kmaq and by leadership such as Jaime and other educators that are well known across Canada, like Dr. Mary Battist, and wrote about the Treaty Peoples, for example, and in the book. We used all of this information to make sure that we try to understand how we can collaborate together to move forward. And that's one part to it only. There's more to talk about it, and you could talk about it in just one whole panel, but that's just an example of that.
Thank you. I think the audience will agree that each panelist could be their own show, kind of speak, so it's better to want more than less. So I'll pose a similar question to the Black community, particularly the African Nova Scotia, to Winnie and Tyler. I mean, as far as I know, there's no treaty like that for the Black community. So what can you offer in terms of the Black community, specifically the African Nova Scotia community, on how to best take care of ourselves and address issues of racism? So either Winnie or Tyler, feel free to put on your video on mic and answer that. Give us some insights, please.
I'll begin, and Tyler can add to that. I think what's really important is that we, historically, we have learned to survive in a racist society. And so what happens is that we sort of go through our day really in survival mode. And I think we need to pause. I think we need to recognize that racism is live and well. And although we know that internally, we still function within society. And so in order to heal, I think it's really important for us to have those dialogues with each other, to have those conversations about racism, the situations of racism that we have, experienced. And I think, for parents, and part of the work that I've done was that I had consciously raised my children to see themselves, to understand who they are as Black women. And just for Kathy, I know it was difficult, it's Kai Asia and Castiva. But their names are very purposeful. their African name. So right from the time that they were children, they were told about their Africanness. They were told about how beautiful they were. And even with all of that influence from their family, engagement in the community, there still is a huge influence of Eurocentric ideology about what is perceived to be beautiful, what is perceived to be right. And so as parents, I needed to be actively involved in their life and to constantly provide them with that message that they are beautiful, that they are and can amount to something, and that they're equally as important in this world as other people, right? And now, even with my new grandson, we are constantly, having him with Black books and infusing him in the community. And so, as Tyler talked about, it's early for him as 10 years old. My daughter was much younger than that when she wanted blonde hair. And so that was a message. And so we as individuals, as parents, need to listen to those messages, but we also need to listen to the message ourselves. How are we impacted by racism? How are some of those decisions that I'm making, how is that impacted by racism? And so I think having those conversations with community is really important, because we can at least see that we are not alone in our way of thinking. We will see, much like what Tyler talked about, maybe shutting down some of those messages that we get through media, but also being proud of who we are and constantly having affirmations, like African affirmations around yourself to remind you, because society, like I indicated earlier, will throw a curveball right when you're in the happiest of mood, right? So you could be like singing and walking up the street, which I have, and someone just hollers something out of their car, and that could ruin your day, or that could create a level of anxiety. And so even as going for a walk, which is perceived to be a healthy self-care mode of action, really becomes a safety issue, right? So now when I'm walking, I need to be mindful as to who's around me, because I don't know if someone's going to attack me because I'm Black. And so I think as a community, we need to be conscious of that, but we also need to have healing sessions within our community and have those conversations, and to affirm each other and to recognize as a community that we are impacted by racism.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Winnie just said, and don't have too much to add to it, but I think that we can definitely heal by just being there for one another. I think that's so important. It's so important that we remember that we're in this together, and with everything going on right now with Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, I think it's important that we hold people accountable together. We uplift each other together. If one of us is down, we help pull another one up, and I think that's how we can heal. And we have to be compassionate towards others, but we also need to be compassionate towards ourselves. We have to know that we are worthy, that we have value, that Black is beautiful. And there's so many things in this world that in subtle ways tells us that Black isn't beautiful in these subtle ways. But we have to know what's real. What's real is that we are powerful, we are beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. And what is coming out from the conversation and from the forum series, that when we talk about we talk about within the community and across the communities of the Black and Indigenous communities. So that's also a powerful message. There's always a question on allyship, but I'll leave that for the end. I want to bring it home to our students, to Lydia and Naomi. But first, I want to say how proud we are of both you, Naomi and Lydia, because as Dal graduates, undergraduate and graduate student, you came out and you did speak truth to power. But not only did you speak truth to power, you also pose recommendations and how to address racism and healing. So I want to say thank you and to let you all know we are very proud of you. But I want to ask, and you, both of you, to answer this question. How could we make more of the Lydias and Naomis at Dalhousie? How can we nurture more students, more Black students, more Indigenous students, more students of color to feel comfortable to speak truth to power and also to put forward recommendations in how to make Dalhousie a true, inclusive, and belonging community? So either you could start.
I can start. I've been writing a little bit about this for my thesis. I'm talking about traumatization and emotional labor of Indigenous students in post-secondary. So this has been on my mind for over a year now. I think to start would be seeing some kind of like anti-oppression trainings and some like historical background for not only like incoming students, but also professors. And this would go beyond like Indigenous studies, like this would include like Black realities, would touch on even like differing genders. Like I've had to deal with like transphobia in my classes. I've had to deal with like anti-Indigenous sentiment, and it makes it so BIPOC students are no longer students in the classroom. Like we have to become teachers and cannot just like sit back and relax. Like I've had to leave class because I've had a panic attack from something my professor said or like allowed to happen in the classroom. And often it's not this intentional like mean-spirited racism. It's just people like not recognizing the harm that they're putting on students. And then so we're trapped in this box of either having to put ourselves out there and say, hey, this was racist, this was insensitive, and have people deny that, or maybe listen and have to like walk them through this like unlearning, or we keep ourselves safe and like don't bring these things up and then have the question of, should I have done that? Like, did I do wrong? Because whenever, at least for me, like whenever I'm in these spaces, I'm just thinking of the next Indigenous students who are coming through, the next queer students, and how can they not experience what I have been experiencing? I think for reading lists, a good book would be Colonized Classrooms by Sheila Cote-Meek, and it talks a lot about emotional labor and this like role that students are faced on and the kinds of racism that we experience in school, because I understand it's not always possible to make up for the lack in our like elementary and high school experiences. Like I think throughout the education system, there's a lot of like truth that's been missing. So students get to university, and how do you teach and like correct for all of these injustices while also if someone's in a very difficult degree. I had a friend who was doing the brain neuroscience. There we go. I'm not super sciencey, but like the amount of like information she was having to learn and go through, I'm like, you don't have time for a full Indigenous history degree, but how do we like just insert those things to make learning a little bit like just adding in like cultural significance, like where it's relevant, like bypassing and like dealing with these like common stereotypes to make it a more accessible space for students, I think that's what I would say.
Yeah. And you know, the university is moving towards making the Indigenous Studies minor term major and the Black Studies minor term major, and we are working on better orientation for students and new faculty and so on. But we're dealing with 400 decades of colonialism and racism. And, you know, the first time I encounter you and now I see a level of maturity, which we're so proud of. You know, there are many things that Dalhousie could do better, but at least we have produced at least 2 great students in you and Lydia. And Lydia, coming to your slide set and some of the quotes that was presented, I mean, those are indicative of the 400 years of colonialization and racism, that we have a very diverse student population. And so these things, and from the conversation, we saw the similarity of what is happening in institutions of higher learning at Dalhousie and the community. And we are part of that community, so it's not totally shocking. But what my question to you is that the students who posted the things on the Instagram felt comfortable doing that on social media, you know, and it's unfortunate that they did not have that level of comfort to come to us, meaning whoever, us meaning Dalhousie, faculty, staff, student officers, leadership, other students, you know, what can we do to provide that kind of space and level of comfort for students to come and speak to us about the issues?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is really sad that some of these people only felt comfortable sharing anonymously. And I think we need to have more spaces for people to come forward with these things. I think since Dal is kind of in the position of power, it is up to the leadership to reach out to these students. I think what happens is someone might experience a microaggression and they might feel as though that's not big enough to warrant coming forward with someone, or they might not be willing to go through all the work. Perhaps they think that there's some administrative stuff. Maybe they think they have to make a huge statement, or they're worried about their name being attached. So I think the message needs to be really clear that these little things, they're not little, that they do matter. And that, so I think if the Human Rights Office, for example, hosted a night where people to come forward, we're looking for racialized students or minority students to share their experiences, big or small, here's a space for it. I think that could be helpful. So I don't think people are aware that these services could help them, especially if they've had bad experiences with administration or with positions of leadership in the past. They might not feel welcomed to do that. So I think just creating spaces like this, for example, shows that we can talk about these things. So creating more spaces where the leadership reaches out to the students, I think is important.
Thank you, Lydia.
Yeah, and I do just want to touch on your other point when you were saying how do we create more Naomis and Lydias, which I found really endearing. I think it starts from young. So I'm interested in childhood, being a child psychologist. It starts from really, really young age in terms of mentoring, letting people know that these positions are available for them, that they can go to university, they can go to high school. Having that representation, I think, is what started. And I'm really fortunate that I knew who I was before coming into this environment. Before I began graduate school, I knew what I wanted to do because I had trained and I had spent time discussing with mentors, with parents, with teachers, and I knew it was possible for me. But some people, they've never had that conversation, or they just assume that it's not possible for them. So letting people know from childhood, from high school, from university, that they're capable and that they have that ability to get to higher places.
Yeah, and we do have certain units associated with Dalhousie that focuses on Black and Indigenous students. We have MOTEP, TYP, the IBM program in the law school, plans, the advising center, and so forth. So it's not that we're a zero-sum game. It's just that we need to do more, and equally important, we need to communicate the resources that are available, including the human rights and equity services, you know? And so I'm hoping forums like this do get messages out. I want to bring the two groups back together again in terms of asking the community representatives and the Dalhousie representatives, how important is it to bring these two communities together, and in what ways can we do this? I mean, the forum was an experimentation, so to speak, spur of the moment, and that's why we are asking, when people ask, you know, will there be another forum? We want you to tell us. So anybody free to say something, help us out here. How do we do this? Is it important? Why should we do it? And not only the university and the community, but the two groups too, the Indigenous and Black communities.
I could offer some points of view. One of the things that we have to be careful about this process in bringing panelists together and two communities very distinct from each other, yet have similar experiences and historic trauma with racism, for example, that's ongoing today even, is putting us together in the same token. And also, it's happened quite often even at Dal and other institutions, not only Dal. I'm not picking on Dal in this sense, but I'm just saying that we've been put together as the Black and Indigenous, BIPOC. All of these situations are all put together in similar strategies. And we've seen in Nova Scotia addressing cultural specific needs by putting the Indigenous and the Black Nova Scotian community together, because for numbers' sake or for convenience, and it's for whom is it convenience, convenient to? It's often to the white, powerful decision makers, government, the systemic parts. So we have to really go back and address the needs of specific cultural needs that are needed for each part. So that's very important that we do that. And also respecting the fact that we have much synergy that is collaborative, and that we can work together as a treaty responsibility, just like Indigenous people, Black people, and whoever else is in our territory here. We also have to respect the fact that there are distinct representations and needs of our communities as well. So that's very important. That's part of the respect process.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And even within groups, we are not homogeneous, even within groups. Within groups, we do have our similarities and differences. And this is one of the cultural shifts that Dalhousie is going through right now with the concept of belong, that you do not have to assimilate to belong. We are a group of different people. Differences can belong together. You know, we don't have to do away with our differences. So I totally agree with your point. Would Tyler or Winnie want to address this aspect of bringing community and university together, and or the two communities?
I think it's, I was going to echo what John had indicated, and what you said, that we're not a homogeneous group. And community is really important. And I think, you know, for Indigenous African Nova Scotians, those who have been here for generations, it is important to bring community or the university to the community and community together, because, you know, much like what Lydia talked about, many of our struggles here is just, as I indicated, it's just about surviving. We want our children to do better. We want our children to believe, but there are so many barriers. And I think that's what I was trying to demonstrate on the chart that I had around how our identity and how our self-esteem combats the psychological impact of racism. And so, you know, when I was a young girl, we didn't go past really Coswell Street, right? And that was because we didn't feel safe. And so we need to be exposing our children to university, to camps in university, but university also needs to come to the community. Like, there needs to be this exchange. I also want to just touch on the question that you raised with Lydia and the other students. You know, I think it's important that students do speak up. As a professor at Dal, excuse me, there is no problem for non-racialized students to speak up. That's a level of privilege that they have. And racialized students feel that they can't speak up, and they do need to reach out, and I want to encourage them to do that. And they need to be able, we need to be able to provide the forum for them to do that. And that's probably, you know, again, why a lot of our students feel that they're not accepted into higher education. So we need to be able to support them and to ensure that they feel safe in those environments as well. So safety is really another key factor that we need to consider.
Thank you, Winnie. We have 6 more minutes, and I will need one of those 6 minutes to thank people, and also to mention, I promised a group of young people who contacted me, Diversity of Nature program, which is a biopic focused educational experience. I said I would mention it on our program because I think this is also a good way of dealing with mental health and healing. So if you are interested, the information is posted in the chat box and on our HRES at dal.ca. So please feel free to support this the student organization that I think it's very important when dealing with, dealing with mental health and healing. So check on the chat box or on our website for that information. So the last few minutes before I do my final closing, does anybody on the panel want to have a last word or a few last words? It's now open. Don't make me feel like I'm in the classroom and have to call on somebody. No moment of silence. Come on, John and Tyler. Tyler, have the last word as well. Go ahead, John. Your microphone is on.
I just wanted to congratulate people, and it's important. I was looking at some of the questions that people were asking, and they're very important comments and questions that we have there, that I think we're all in a continuum of learning about racism itself. It's so difficult even to bring up the R word in some situations, and I often refer to it as the R-rated discussion that we must have everywhere. One of the things that's very important is that how do we mandate people's accountability for this, and what's your personal and societal process with that? I mean, we have to look at it from very distinct and very cultural perspectives when we want to understand this. I mean, I've learned from very distinct ways, even within an Indigenous perspective with other panelists in this discussion. So we have to continue learning, and we have to continue sharing some of those ideas. There's theoretical stuff that's out there, but there's also very powerful stories that make a shift towards a social consciousness that is better, that will make us more unified to address these things. Indigenous lives matter, Black lives matter. These are all very powerful tools and voices of a collective that's impacting all of us.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for their voices, we wouldn't be having this discussion, and we'll need to continue to build on that. That's all I wanted to share.
Yeah.
Thank you. Awalalio.
Thank you. Tyler, do you want to have the last word?
Yeah, sure, I have the last word. I see that Archie asked a question about what advice I would give to males from North Preston who are experiencing issues of racism and how we can overcome stigma. I'd say that I see a lot of it in the community, and I want people to know that it's okay to reach out. There's no shame in getting help. There's no shame in seeing a therapist. I think at this stage of the world that everybody should be seeing a therapist, honestly. But it's really important to know that it's important to take care of your mental health, and these different stereotypes that people have of us, thinking that we're lazy, thinking that we are going to steal, or so many different things. Just knowing who you truly are in your heart. And sometimes it takes some effort to figure out who you really are and to connect deeper with yourself. And I do that with things like meditation. And there's so many ways to do that. We can journal, we can read different books. I read books by people like James Baldwin, Black men who are vulnerable, because we grow up and we're often taught that as Black men, we can't show emotion, that we can't be vulnerable. And it's important to change that narrative. It's important to let people know that the cool thing to do is to love people. The cool thing to do is to show people that you love them, and to cry if you have to cry. That's the cool thing to do. That's the healthy thing to do.
Thank you, Tyler. And in closing, I would like to thank all the panelists tonight and for the past 2 episodes. I'd like to thank my co-host, Catherine, the 3-woman team who has backed me up from day 1 to now. You, the audience, who have been wonderful. You make us do this over and over. And to the network of communications people who put our ads out there. Again, as a reminder, we would like to get your feedback on whether the forum should continue, possible themes that we should address, any kind of feedback, pros and cons. As we say, the forum series is Speak Truth to Power, so feel free to speak truth to us about the forum. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you, and
Hi.
night, and
Could I?
stay well and be safe. Kathy, go ahead.
Yep, I just want to thank everyone as well. And I wanted to acknowledge John Lewis for being such an inspiration to the world, and the way he taught so many people to be. And I'd also like to acknowledge somebody who took the courage to tell the truth through residential schools, Isabel Knockwood, who just passed away and had a ceremony today in Shubenacadie. And she, her book, Out of the Depths, has been really instrumental in opening up the dialogue. So in our way, you gave us gifts of your words and your wisdom, and I'd just like to quickly end with a thank you song to you, taught to me by Donna Augustine, and I'll sing it in English. And it's my gift to all of you. Malalan. Yo ya he ye ya he yo. Thank you, Great Spirit, for thunder in the sky. Thanks for the daytime and for the night. Thanks for the seasons that are part of life. And thanks for the way of our lives. Yo ya he ye ya he yo. Yo ya he ye ya he yo. Tahoe. Okay, Malalan.